the nation's capital, the foothill of Cedar Hill, the Lion of Anacostia, Freddie Douglass home. We're here to host the response to the housing crisis locally and nationally. Today, this is a third party politic response because we've seen this crisis go unaddressed in the corporate debates thus far. And there was only mention in passing by the VP nominee. And ironically, she refused to prosecute the foreclosure king when she had the opportunity to do so, and he's now the Secretary of Treasury. This is where we are. No one's come to save us. We got to save ourselves. Um, Ari Teresa, a local lawyer here in Washington, D.C., says that we have a problem when society values profits over humanity. We would like to believe our government is here for our benefit. That's Ari Teresa, Stoop Law here in Washington, D.C. And I also like to share another quote. I worry about the direction of the world. I worry about a culture where only the physically or materially dominant have the right to speak. And that's the late, great Bill Withers, Grammy award winning Bill Withers. And that may partially explain why third party candidates are not included in debates. Solutions to the impending housing crisis were absent during the corporate debates, and we're here to address it today. We also at the heels of October 16th, which is a very special day. It's the 25th anniversary of the Million Man March, the largest gathering here in Washington, D.C., where crime was not committed for over a week. That was the impetus for me to go back to my community to do something. And it was also the anniversary of the greatest white man America has ever produced, John Brown, and Harper's Ferry, the first Civil War. And We Act Radio was officially started November 11th, 2011, in honor of our ninth anniversary. We're asking all of our attendees here today to go to We Act Radio Facebook page, like the page, so we can reach 11,000, because we was founded on 11, 11, 11, and then we only need 59 more people to become 411s, and that is in honor of October 16th, 1859, the first Civil War. And in lieu of that, Abraham Lincoln has a quote. It has been discredited, but it was attributed to him, and I think is a very accurate depiction of where we are today. He says, supposedly, I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the current country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. That is where we are with this impending housing crisis in the midst of a pandemic. Housing is a vital and critical part of health. Without addressing health, it will undermine the efforts to address the health crisis. And that is Wayne Turnage, DC Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services and the Director of the District of Columbia Healthcare Finance Department. And I say that to say this, is that one of our community partners, Whitman Walker Health, has their Walk in 5K to end HIV 1024. They have been testing, COVID testing here in the city, free testing for all those who come out in DC. And so we want to ask everyone to support to end HIV on 1024. And this event raises hundreds of thousands of dollars to support their mission. It also helps them provide care to over 20,000 people every year. So you can walk, run, or donate through December 31st at walktoendhiv.org. That's the Walk to End HIV, hashtag Walk to End HIV, and the website is walktoendhiv.org. You can walk in your city, you can donate to the end of the year, and this contributes to the testing of COVID. All right, now having said all that, so all of this is intersectionality. The evils of capitalism and as real as the evils of militarism and as evils of racism, is Martin Luther King's words. We are here to show how housing is not only a human right, but is also a part of our health. And healthcare is also should be a human right. This is part of the Universal Human Rights Declaration signed by Eleanor Roosevelt. And we're here to claim our check that has not been honored. And here to address that today is our third party candidate, leading presidential third party candidate, Howie Hawkins. He is an American trade unionist and environmental activist from New York. He's co-founder of the Green Party of the United States, and he's the party's presidential nominee for the 2020 presidential election. Welcome, Howie Hawkins.
Thank you.
And joining us today is Will Merrifield, D.C. Council at Large candidate here in Washington, D.C., because we hear all politics are local, but we're also taking it to the stage on a national level. And we're here to talk about solutions to the housing crisis. Welcome to Will Merrifield.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, I know that was a big engage, but it's a big problem, so I had to set this up. And for those who are unaware, my name is Kimon Freeman again. I was initially involved with third-party politics 20 years ago in year 2000. I voted for the third-party candidate then, Ralph Nader, and then I was dismayed by how people blamed him for George Bush becoming president. Not George Bush's brother, who practiced voter suppression in the state of Florida, not the Supreme Court that declared him president, but the third-party candidate, demonizing the third-party candidate. So I went on to work for Ralph Nader in 2004 under the recommendation of my mentor, Kevin Zeese, who just passed away, rest in power to Kevin Zeese. And I worked in New York driving a corporate crime buster vehicle, promotional campaign vehicle for Ralph Nader in 2004. So that's my experience with third-party politics. And up till today, how can third-party politics address the housing crisis that has been omitted in the debates thus far? I turn the floor over to you, our presidential candidate of the Green Party, Mr. Howie Hawkins.
Well, we do it the way third parties have done throughout our history, and that is to bring issues that the major parties won't address into the public debate. We have a long tradition of this, started with the Liberty Party. Whigs and the Democrats didn't want to deal with the question of slavery and the abolitionist movement. And so it was the Liberty Party that brought that forward in the 1840s. You mentioned John Brown earlier. I'm in Syracuse, New York. They had a Liberty Party convention here, and there was a fugitive enslaved person, we call him Jerry, and they went over to the jail and liberated him and got him up to Canada. We actually have a monument for that in downtown. And whenever we have, demonstrations against police brutality and injustice, we do it in front of that monument. So that's what third parties have done since the 1840s. The populist movements put the question of, that was the Greenback Labor Party and then the People's Party, put the questions of monopoly and banking and money reform and land reform. And actually they fought to restore voting rights to Black people in the South after the Redeemer governments suppressed those rights, or were beginning to in the years between the Civil War and the turn of the century. And then the Socialist Party put the question of public provision of the people's needs, like housing, like healthcare, like you were talking about, like getting rid of child labor, like an 8-hour day. And that's how Green parties or third parties have put new issues on the agenda, which have been partially adopted. And what the Green Party contributed is the Green New Deal. I was the first candidate to campaign for that in 2010 in this country. Became our signature issue in the next decade. Our presidential candidate, Jill Stein, ran on a Green New Deal for America as her theme in 2012 and 2016. And we still need it. It got national attention when the Sunrise Movement sat in Speaker Pelosi's office. And then the polling showed over 80% of the people want it, including 64% of Republicans. But the Democrats took that Green New Deal, diluted the content. Pelosi never let them vote on their non-binding resolution for a Green New Deal. When it went to the Senate, McConnell said, well, I'm gonna have you all vote on it because half you Democrats are running for president. And Schumer said, that's a trick. Said, we're voting president. And all the Democrats voted president, except 4 of them voted no with the Republicans. Now it's not even mentioned in Joe Biden's climate plan or the Democratic platform. So now it's buried.
During the debates, both parties gleefully denounced the Green New Deal.
That's right. That's why we need the Green Party. We've got it into the discussion. Now we got to keep fighting to get it implemented. So I tell people, particularly in DC, where Trump's, there's a model projecting the election from The Economist magazine. They have Trump below 5%. I mean, if I don't beat Trump on the statehood Green Party, I'll be disappointed because
that's not going to happen. You're definitely going to beat Trump in Washington D.C.
Okay, well, good. That will send him packing because I expect that's what's going to happen, and I'll give him that extra boot in his butt as he goes out the door.
All right, I think that's going to be one of the tools we use to promote this interview here today, is to make sure that we deliver more votes for Green Party and third party candidates in Washington D.C. than Trump. And here to stretch out our conversation to ensure that happens, because we're responsible for one vote for Will Merrifield here in Washington D.C. He's a local phenomenon that's bringing some solutions to the housing crisis. He's an at-large candidate. Will Merrifield, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Kimon. I really appreciate it. And I just to echo what Howie said. I mean, on the local level, we're dealing with this acute affordable housing crisis, and a lot of politicians, for the last decade, have been going around and talking about the affordable housing crisis, how it's the #1 issue in Washington, D.C., how it needs to be solved. But we have never solved that problem. Instead, that problem continues to get worse and worse and worse on the local level. D.C. being the city that's experienced the most displacement over the last decade of working class Black Washingtonians, especially. And, we are seeing that every year rents are rising, and we're dealing with this horrific family homelessness crisis on the back end of things. Before running, I was an attorney at the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless, and I've been representing tenant associations across the District of Columbia, fighting in order to preserve their affordable housing in the face of these large-scale redevelopment projects. And what I've seen, in doing that work for the last decade, is that all too often our local elected leaders are working directly with politically connected developers and giving them hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer money and public land to continue to build luxury housing that working class Washingtonians can't afford. So I'm running on a campaign in opposition to that. I'm happy that, our campaign is not just offering a critique of the crisis, but we're also offering a proactive solution. And that solution is premised in essence, a Green New Deal for Washington, D.C. We're running to create thousands of units of green social housing to solve the affordable housing crisis, to create a jobs program for people in Washington, D.C. post-pandemic, get money back into people's pockets, and get that money recycled back into the local economy so that we can jumpstart this local economy post-pandemic and solve the affordable housing crisis. But for that to work, the government has to look at housing as an infrastructure project, and the government has to cut out the developer influence over housing policy in Washington, D.C. And essentially, that's what a social housing, what a social housing program does. I can explain how social housing works in a minute if you want me to right now, but I don't want to bogart.
I think you should take this time to go ahead and set the stage for that, because we're going to spend a great deal of time doing a deep dive on social housing as opposed to public housing.
Sure. So social housing, the way it works is the government, like I said, looks at housing as an infrastructure project. It builds housing. That housing is accessible to anyone at 30% of their income. So everybody anybody that wants to can move into the social housing building. The people who make more money, their rents subsidize the rents of the people who are making, not as much money. And because we've essentially eliminated the profit motive, 100% of rent is used productively. It's invested right back into the building to cover the operating cost of the building. At the end of the month, the building has a surplus. That surplus would have been a big profit for a developer. So that profit turns into a surplus for the building, and that surplus is actually used to pay off the construction loans for the building. So social housing is a way to create mixed income deeply affordable housing that actually pays for itself. And we do that by eliminating the profit motive and creating, the surplus, a surplus at the end of the month for the building instead of a profit for the developer.
And how does this gel with you? Because I like I like the sound of what I heard, but I'm also an advocate for making sure that we separate housing costs from market rates to income. And I don't think anyone should be paying more than 30% of their income in housing. What is your take on all of this?
Well, as part of our Green New Deal, we call it public housing. You can call it social housing like they do in Europe. But what we're talking about is direct public provision of affordable housing. And our plan is to build 25 million new units of public or social housing around the country in the next decade. And it's 25 million because that's what we need to solve the crisis of affordability. There's 10 million very low income people that do not have access to affordable housing. And if it's going to be mixed income like Will is talking about, which it should be, public housing should not be just for poor people of color, where you put the projects in the worst part of town and segregate them. Should be for everybody, like they do in Europe. They're professionals, middle income working people, and low income people living in the same developments. Yeah. And we need to do that to reduce segregation and integrate everybody into the mainstream of our society. So 25 million, we set aside 40% for the very low income. And that takes care of the nearly 10 million people who are either homeless or spending not 30% of their income, but a quarter of the people spend more than half of their income on housing. Half the people spend more than 30% of their income on housing now. So there is a Green New Deal public housing program that Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez put forward, but it's only for 2.5 million units. And I don't understand why you would propose that when it doesn't meet the need. And I suppose it's because they figure that's as far as they can get with the Democratic Party. But our role is to pose real solutions. And in fact, you go back to 1968, when the Fair Housing Law passed, Congress also passed a bill to build 25 million units of affordable housing. The problem was, this was the early inklings of what we now call neoliberalism, these public-private partnerships, where the public pays and the private developers make the profits. And that's more expensive per unit because you got to pay for that profit margin. And that housing never got built because it was about desegregation. And then the Nixon administration came in and they didn't really want to do that. So the housing never got built. There were some so-called affordable housing developments out of that program, and they depended on tax breaks that ran out after about 30 years. And if you look at those projects, as they ran out of the tax break, the owner either let them disintegrate to the point where they had to be torn down or prepared them for jacking up the rent and gentrifying that development. So we got to go through the public sector and build it at cost for public benefit rather than hand it over to these private developers who will only build affordable housing if we subsidize them. And that costs us more.
It does cost more. And we've seen, to your point, Howie, that it's a complete grift. I mean, we've been fooled to believe in this housing policy in Washington, D.C., that, these politicians that are getting their campaigns funded by developers are then telling us, the citizens, that in order to solve the affordable housing crisis, we have to give more and more money away to private developers. So they build more and more luxury apartments. And at some point, that housing will trickle down and we'll be able to get, underneath the affordable housing crisis that way. That is a complete grift. I mean, that's just, the siphoning of DC residents' taxpayer money to developers to build things that aren't for the collective and that is never going to get underneath the problem, is never going to solve the problem. I've, litigated against developers for the last, 8 years. And when you get developers on the stand, when you get them in depositions, they will tell you very clearly that it's not their job to solve the affordable housing crisis. Their job is to maximize profit. They have a duty to their shareholders to do so, and that, you know, they're not in the business of creating affordable housing for people. So any politician that tells you that we need to keep giving them our taxpayer money to incentivize them to do so, they're either in on the scam, they're either in on the grift, or they're extremely naive about the process of housing and how it works in the United States.
Well, clearly we have seen that the capitalism won't protect us from COVID-19, so therefore we cannot expect capitalism to protect us from the impending housing crisis. And with the impending moratoriums on evictions coming to expiration, this is a crisis of a massive magnitude that may bring this country to its knees. And I wanted to share a quote again. This is from Milton Friedman, who is not a progressive, but even a broke clock is right 2 times a day. He went on to say, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are laying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. Again, that's Milton Friedman. Brother, I like to say the presidential nomination, our presidential nominee, what do you think has been politically impossible that's now politically inevitable?
Well, Medicare for all. I think a Green New Deal, ending the endless wars. I mean, these are things that poll nationally. That's where the majority of people are at. The problem with our political system is Donald Trump and Joe Biden are against all 3 of those things. And I could lengthen that list. So Milton Friedman was right. I mean, he used it to introduce right-wing ideas, like the crisis in Chile when Pinochet came in, and, you know, then they tried
the original 9/11.
Yeah, and so, you know, that's when Naomi Klein calls it disaster capitalism. You get a disaster and then they accelerate or intensify capitalist exploitation, but it works the other way too. So again, that's the role of a third party. This is a particularly tough year for us because we never had a president in modern history that is so openly racist and scapegoating religious and racial minorities and immigrants and ruling by division. So people are understandably outraged by that, but there are no real solutions from the Democrats in this. In fact, you look at the Democratic machines in all the cities, and behind them are the developers, the real estate industry. Look at New York City, which I'm more familiar with than Washington, D.C. Big affordability crisis. The rising rents are driving the working class out of Manhattan and much of Brooklyn. And Bill de Blasio, who was elected nominally as a progressive, has an affordable housing program, which is a public-private partnership, subsidizing affordable units, but you have to have at least $60,000 in income to get into those affordable units, which half the people that work in New York City, they're below that. And now he's privatizing public housing by basically contracting out all the services that maintain the public housing. So that's a big fight, but that's more costly than directly providing it in-house. I was down there at a demonstration in one of those projects, and people were saying, we've already seen this, because it used to be the housing authority had their own police, and they worked in the buildings that knew all the residents. And they got rid of that, and now they have New York Police Department cops come into the projects. They don't know anybody. And there's been a lot more incidents of assault and shootings by the police of people in the projects. And that's what happens when you outsource. So what I'm saying is these democratic machines, they're the creature of the real estate industry. And when they talk about affordable housing, it's really about how to reward their donors, who are the real estate industry.
Mm-hmm. The iconic comedian and actor Chris Rock was in the New York Times a few weeks ago, and he was quoted as saying that no one is more inhumane than landlords. And we need to make a obvious distinction between, small mom and pop operation landlords that may own, one building with 6 units in it, versus the multinational corporations that own wide swaths of property in cities that they don't even live in. I think that capitalism is now on trial. When the moratoriums on eviction ends, what is the solution that should be pursued to address housing as a human right?
Well, I mean, first of all, we have to keep people stabilized and make sure that rents get canceled for people who can't pay their rent due to, the inability to work during COVID-19. Like I said, I worked for the legal clinic. I represented tenant associations, but once a week, I had to answer every call that came into the legal clinic. And I can tell you that those calls were mostly single moms, working 1 and a lot of times 2 minimum wage jobs that were living in their cars with their children because they couldn't afford rent in Washington, D.C. There are no subsidies available in Washington, D.C. And they were calling the legal clinic not to access housing, but just to be able to access shelter, because shelters are at capacity in Washington, D.C. So pre-pandemic, we had this crisis which, made it so that, shelters were at complete capacity. So if we do not stabilize people, if we do not cancel rent for people post-COVID-19, we're going to be looking at a second, health crisis coming off the pandemic. So it's essential that we cancel rent. And then moving forward, like you said, we have to move towards a better system. Howie was talking about public housing in New York. In Washington, D.C., public housing is absolutely under attack. The federal government has stopped investing in public housing, and our local government has not made the necessary repairs to our public housing stock due to that federal disinvestment. So now that's being used as an excuse to privatize and demolish our public housing units. And it just so happens that those units of public housing now are being demolished in the places first that sit on the most valuable real estate in Washington, D.C. So again, this is giving away of affordable housing to eliminating affordable housing, giving it to politically connected developers. That's why when we look at different models and where we're going to go to next, the social housing model is the model that, I believe in my research is the most attractive model when we think about how we're going to use this pandemic as a portal to step through into something better. Because the social housing model has a mix of incomes in it, and those mix of incomes allow renters to be able to cover the operating costs of the building. We are not dependent on an administration and the federal government to continue to fund that housing. Instead, that building is self-sufficient. The rents, by eliminating the profit motive and creating a mix of incomes in the building, the rents are enough to cover the operating cost of the building. There's a tremendous documentary called The Pruitt-Igoe Myth. I don't know if you've seen it, Kimon, but it's about a public housing complex in St. Louis. And, it was built, and when it was first built, the documentary, talks to people that lived in it when they were a kid, and they talk about it like it was paradise. And it was because there was a mix of incomes. It was Black working class in St. Louis lived in this public housing complex. And the government over the years means tested it more, so that the rents could not cover the operating costs of the building. The federal government disinvested in public housing, and the Pruitt-Igoe, that public housing complex, crumbled around its residents. So we have to create forms of housing that are self-sustainable and that are decommodified as we move forward. And that's what I believe the social housing model does. To Howie's point earlier, with the amount of public housing or social housing units needed across the country, it's the 25 million is, you should put the real number on it. We did a great Facebook Live event with a person from Vienna, Austria, who worked in the social housing department on our campaign website. And in Vienna, Austria, there's 400,000 units of housing outside the private market. And she talked about where she lived. She grew up. She was the person that was, on this interacting with our campaign. She was an architect, but she had been a single mom in college, put herself through architecture school because she was able to afford this social housing. And she lived on a floor with a physician, a pensioner, a person who was on a fixed income, and a cab driver, and herself, a single mom who had, now become an architect. So it's the model that mixes incomes and allows for operating costs to be covered. And it's essential that we're moving to self-sufficiency in our housing.
For those who are just joining us, we're here giving our response to the housing crisis locally and nationally. We're joined by Howard Hawkins, the Green Party presidential candidate, and also Will Merrifield, DC at-large council candidate here in Washington, D.C. You're listening to We Act Radio, broadcasting live on the radical side of Martin King Avenue. All right. Now, Howard, what is the Green Party's position on council rent?
Well, there's a bill that Ilhan Omar put into the House, and it didn't get into the HEROES Act. It's called the Cancel Rent and Mortgage Bill, but it does more than that. It actually has the federal government pay where people can't afford their rent or their mortgage to the small landlords as well as the big ones, the banks, community banks and credit unions, as well as bigger banks, so that if you just stop the rent and mortgages, you don't have domino effect of businesses going bankrupt because people aren't, providing the income they usually rely on. And that's not just landlords, including small landlords, which account for about 45% of the units in the country, but it's all the businesses that maintain property managers, maintenance people. And all those people depend on an income stream. So the good thing about that bill is it keeps that income flowing so we don't go deeper into this coronavirus depression. And then the other thing the bill had was if any rental property goes on the market for sale during this COVID emergency, public housing authorities and nonprofit affordable housing groups have the first right to purchase those properties. So it could expand the sector of nonprofit affordable housing. And that's a good bill, I think, to deal with this emergency so that people aren't, when these eviction moratoriums end, we're looking at tens of millions of people potentially could be evicted. I think the other thing we need, short of the full public housing program, which will take a while to implement, is universal rent control. Because in a lot of places, the landlords are looking for the first chance to jack up the rents, force the low-income tenants out so they can bring in new people that can pay higher rents. That's something I've seen a lot in New York City. We did that during World War II when the federal government was focused on producing arms to beat the fascists around the world, and they weren't building housing and the rents started to rise. So they set up universal rent control across the country. And in a lot of places like New York City, where they still have rent regulation, those regulations derive from that period. And that's what we need now, given that the rent is too damn high all over the country and people are being forced out. And now we have nearly 1 million people that are homeless every night. And so that's an immediate stopgap while we build a social or public housing sector.
Now, Howie, you were in New York, and over this past summer, there was a message circulating on social media from a group calling themselves the People of New York. They claim credit for civil disobedience. The corporate media called it mischief, but we call it civil disobedience, saying that they were evicting the housing court from its Living Street location. They went on to say that we, the people of New York City, do hereby evict the Brooklyn Housing Court from its premises on 141 Livingston Street, Brooklyn, New York, for failure to serve the people of Brooklyn in fair, ethical, and conscientious practice, and for resuming evictions despite the unprecedented need for relief and affordable housing. The authorities discovered the words eviction equals violence, eat the landlords on the exterior of the locked up courthouse by foam and bike locks. Do you see more of these confrontations escalating in the future if the system continues to try to evict people in the midst of a pandemic?
I think it's inevitable. When you have mass evictions and people going out in the streets, people are going to organize and fight back, fight for shelter, fight for a place to live. I think there's going to be more and more of that. And we have a history of that. During the Great Depression in New York City, they had, whoever the authority was, maybe it was a sheriff, it is in most counties, but whoever it was would show up to evict people, and other people would show up to block the evictors. Or if the furniture was out on the street, they'd move it back into the apartment. And that pushed back the mass evictions for a while. So I expect to see more of that as we go forward.
We're having these discussions because it's necessary to break the yoke of the corporate party systems that are refusing to address the real issues of the people and the real solutions to the issues of the people. Here in Washington, D.C., I had the good fortune of reading a book about community land trusts that worked in Boston, that saved South Bend, Boston, and Roxbury from displacement. This was in the 80s. They called them yuppies during that time. But community land trust supports permanently affordability through community ownership. You get more information at douglasclt.org, douglasclt.org. Community land trust is something that has not been utilized broadly, but it's something that we should be pursuing here in the nation's capital. It is starting to gain traction with our work here on the ground. How can we expand community land trust on a national level, Mr. Howard Hawkins?
Well, it can be part of the programs coming out of HUD to encourage communities. I mean, what they did with that Dudley Street initiative is cede to that nonprofit corporation that was community controlled the right of eminent domain. It was the strongest community land trust in the country. And they were able to secure not just homes, but also small businesses in their business districts. Because this was a community where a lot of businesses had left. We have food deserts all over the country right now in a lot of cities. And if you have that kind of nonprofit organization, they can focus on a thing like getting a grocery store back into the neighborhood. So the federal government can provide incentives and funding.
Preferably a co-op grocery store, not a corporate chain, but something that is owned and managed by the people that actually live in that community. Just want to throw that sidebar in there.
Yeah, no, I helped. We attempted to get a food co-op going in my food desert, and down the street a corporate chain came in, and both of them failed, possibly because of the competition. A lot of reasons, but the corporate chain couldn't hack it any more than our co-op could. This is one of the most concentrated poverty census districts in the country, and so that's a huge issue. You could also do it municipally. Milwaukee, when the socialists ran it in the 1910s, when there was high food price cost inflation, they started municipal grocery stores where the people could get food at cost. So, it's another way to do it. I think, co-ops are great because they develop people along with the economy. When the people are managing a business collectively, they have a lot of skills and they get a lot of sense of their own power. And so the co-op model is great, I think, but we need to look at the municipal model too.
Okay. Will, we just got a few short moments left in this program. Is there anything we're missing in terms of addressing the housing crisis and solutions necessary to address it?
No, I think it's been a great conversation. I mean, like I said, I'm running on a social housing platform. I think social housing is part of the solution. Social housing can be built to scale if the government looks at this as an infrastructure project, but we also need, as you guys have said, to expand rent control, to invest in cooperative ownership opportunities for people, but, essentially decommodifying the market. I think that that's the most important part of this process. Housing has become such a expensive commodity, especially in these coastal cities where international capital is flooding in to these coastal cities, washing around, and there's a lot of political corruption and the giving away of our tax dollars to further commodify the housing market and make it completely unaffordable for people. So I just appreciate you having us on. Appreciate the conversation to be able to talk about these different strategies to decommodify the market.
Thank you very much. And my whole 2 cents is that we need to separate the housing market forces from income in terms of determining what housing costs are. I think housing costs should be determined by your income. 30% of your income should determine your housing. And I think that everyone should be embracing that across the board. With having said that, Howie Hawkins, presidential candidate for Green Party, your closing comments.
Well, we have to understand that the housing industry is becoming more capitalistic than ever. Private equity, as well as international investors, own more and more of the rental housing from a great distance, which they manage through property managers. So if you're a tenant, you often have no idea who owns your building. And your property manager sometimes is under contract, they can't tell you. And then we have to realize that the two-party system is very much behind this. You got to remember, Donald Trump was part of the funding of the Democratic machine in New York City as a real estate developer. And you mentioned Kamala Harris not going after Steve Mnuchin, who's now the Treasury Secretary, for predatory, racist lending and foreclosures in California, when her staff gave her 1,000 indictments and she let it go. And then Mnuchin gave her $2,000 to run for Senate. Trump and his daughter gave, I think it was a total of $6,000 to Kamala Harris. So despite all the, cats and dogs rhetoric we see at them, going after each other.
I'm sorry to stop your shine, brother. You're on the road, but did you say that Steve Mnuchin, I don't know, whatever, the foreclosure king that she refused to prosecute, donated to her campaign for her Senate run?
$2,000, yes.
Just want to make sure that was on the record. Okay.
So, behind all the fighting you see on TV, when it comes time to do business behind closed doors, these people are coming from the same place. And that's why we need third party and independent people to represent us who are not bought and owned and indentured to that industry if we're going to have a solution to the housing problem.
And I need to reiterate a quote from Grammy Award winner, the iconic Bill Withers, for those who still are in the back of the classroom with their headphones on, who think are demonizing third-party politics as if we somehow working with the GOP agenda. He went on to say, I worry about the direction of the world. I worry about a culture where only the physically or materially dominant have the right to speak. All right. I want to thank you both for joining us here today. And our closing words come from the great Martin Luther King, because We Act Radio broadcasts live on the radical side of Martin Luther King Avenue in the nation's capital. He went on to say, because everyone's familiar with King's last speech, but his next to his last speech was delivered here in Washington, D.C., and it was called Remaining Awake During a Great Revolution. This is what he had to say. One of the great liabilities of life is that all too many people find themselves living amid a great period of social change, and yet they fail to develop the new attitudes and the new mental responses that the new situation demands. They end up sleeping through a revolution, a great revolution. Thank you, gentlemen, for participating in this great revolution. More power to you. Stay safe, stay strong, stay woke, and let's do this again. We Act Radio, do something.